Welcome, everyone. We're going to get started in just a minute, just letting everybody join the Zoom room. While you're waiting, go ahead and respond to our poll. And also put in the chat your name, organization affiliation, and where you're located. That way we know who all is here. And we'll get started in just a minute. If you're just joining us, feel free to respond to our poll and also introduce yourselves in the chat. And we're going to get started in just a minute as people finish joining. All right, well, let's go ahead and get started. If you are just joining us, feel free to introduce yourselves in the chat. It's great to see so many friends, colleagues, and new names and people we don't know. So great to have you all here. And I'm going to end the poll so you all can see the breakdown of who is here. We have a mix of people from law enforcement, attorneys, government, nonprofit attorneys, private practice attorneys, social service providers, survivors, mental health professionals, and interested community members and students. So a great mix of people, and that helps us understand who's in the audience. My name is Jamie Beck, and I'm the president and managing attorney of Free to Thrive. And I am beyond thrilled to have this esteemed panel today to talk about an issue that is something that at Free to Thrive, we've really dove into this issue, learning more about how we can better work with law enforcement, what we can do to support law enforcement operations, looking into businesses involved in trafficking individuals, and particularly illicit massage businesses. And for those of you that have attended our last two parts of our training, this is our third and final part. It's been an incredible partnership between Free to Thrive, Sanctuary for Families, and ECPAT USA. So just thank you all for being a part of this journey with us and learning with us. And today, hopefully, will culminate a really fantastic series. So I want to dive right in because we have a lot to talk about. Before we get into our panel discussion, if you've attended our webinars before, you know this, but we will be sending the training out, the recording afterwards. I know that's a question people often ask, and you're all muted. We can't see you, we can't hear you. So feel free to do what you need to take care of yourselves. If you're able to go for a walk, get some fresh air. I love doing that while I'm at webinars, but do whatever you need to do for yourself. Oh, and of course, if you want to join the conversation, you can add your comments into the chat, continue to introduce yourselves if you're just joining. And if you have questions, put those in the Q&A, and I'll be trying to moderate the Q&A during the discussion. We have a lot of questions that we want to get through, but I'll do my best to answer your questions as we go along. But we do plan to save time for questions at the end. So know that if we don't get to your questions as we're having our discussion, know that we will definitely answer them at the end. So feel free to put them in whenever you think of them. And with that, I want to introduce our esteemed panel of experts. First, we have Christopher Tenorio, who is an assistant U.S. attorney and civil rights enforcement coordinator at the U.S. Attorney's Office for the Southern District of California, which is in San Diego. And I'd like each panelist to introduce themselves, give a little bit of background on their experience working with the API community on human trafficking cases. And so, Chris, I'll kick it off and have you introduce yourself, and then we'll have the other panelists introduce themselves.
Thanks, Jamie. Yes, and prior to my current position, I was with the Civil Rights Division out of DC and did a lot of human trafficking cases, the first being in 1998 in South Florida. And then after that, I was counsel to Eric Holder when he was the Deputy Attorney General and had oversight responsibilities of the Civil Rights Division. But when I came home to San Diego in just before the turn of the millennium, started doing civil rights cases and forced labor cases, which has been my most recent focus. In the API community in particular, we've found a lot of trafficking cases that would include forced labor. We have a current case pending of a nail salon worker out of the San Diego area, former case of a woman from Indonesia that was being held against her will and required to provide healthcare service and maid duties in San Diego. So something we're constantly aware of and constantly vigilant for.
Thank you. Next, we have Jane Anderson, who's an attorney advisor for Equitas. She's located in San Francisco, and Equitas is headquartered in Washington, D.C.
Thank you. It's really a pleasure to be amongst all these great panelists. I am an attorney advisor, which means that I have the privilege of being funded to provide support, consultations, and trainings to prosecutors, law enforcement, and allied professionals around the country. Most of this is grant funded through various federal grants, and I work with a lot of task forces. This topic we're going to be talking about today is one of our most common topics because it is pretty challenging, and so we need to be thinking creatively and working together. I am a former prosecutor, having worked for the Miami-Dade State Attorney's Office early in my career doing domestic violence, sexual violence, and being one of the co-founders of their human trafficking task force. Had the privilege of trying a lot of Florida's first state level human trafficking cases.
Thank you, Jane. Next up, we have Mike Ju, who is a detective with Broward County Sheriff's Department in the FBI Child Exploitation and Human Trafficking Task Force, and he's located in South Florida. And Mike will not be on video today. He is an undercover detective and needs to keep his image secret so he can keep doing the important work that he's doing. So Mike, go ahead and introduce yourself.
Good afternoon. I greatly appreciate this opportunity to speak with everyone present. Like Jamie had mentioned, I'm with the Broward County Sheriff's Office. I'm currently assigned with our Strategic Investigations Division. And my experience working within the API community initially began back in 2013 when I was assigned to a crime suppression team with one of our local districts, City of Tamarack, as a result of numerous prostitution complaints stemming from citizens concerned about human trafficking and prostitution occurring within massage parlors. Back in 2013, it was an exponential explosion of those storefront brick and mortar businesses. And at the time, a lot of citizens, and to be honest, our department itself didn't know what we were looking at, what the extent of the victimization was. So we initiated investigations, and that pretty much led me to gaining a level of understanding on how the businesses work here in South Florida.
Thank you, Detective Chu. And last but certainly not least, Joseph Scaramucci, who's a detective with the McLennan County Sheriff's Office in Waco, Texas.
Yeah, so my name is Joe Scaramucci. I'm a detective with the Sheriff's Office here in Waco. I'm also a task force officer with Homeland Security based out of Austin. Been in investigations since 2008, spent the early part of my investigative career working homicide, really any deaths and sex crimes. Shifted into trafficking back in 2014. Worked a ton of, and kind of like Mike Ju just said, not knowing really what we were dealing with, illicit massage businesses. So having to shift from what we were used to in what I would say like hotel-based human trafficking operations or any other type, human trafficking, to that venue was kind of a learning curve that took us a bit. We work now with agencies throughout the country. We'll actually fly out and help them with their operations, walk them through how to do them. I'm proud to say that we've shut down 100% of the illicit massage businesses in our jurisdiction, as well as a couple other jurisdictions. We've never had another one reopen in any jurisdiction. Yeah, just looking forward to being able to share what we can with this.
Thank you. And with that, I'm going to dive right into our questions. We have a lot to talk about, and hopefully we'll have a lively discussion among our panelists. So we're hoping to keep this interactive both with the panelists themselves and also with our audience. So join in the conversation. So my first question is for Detective Ju. If you could tell us about the business model of illicit massage businesses.
Absolutely. So kind of to piggyback what Joe said, a lot of the prostitution complaints were popular at the hotels. A lot of times we were trying to figure out why are we getting a lot of complaints from these brick and mortar business fronts. And, as we delved into it, we became to understand that it provides a layer of protection for the owners and for the actual workers from law enforcement. Also, it provides a layer of protection for the people that are engaged from the actual Johns. So a lot of times when there are people involved in commercial sex work or prostitution, they're worried about either Johns, a violent John, or law enforcement, so they have almost like two worries when it comes to being involved in prostitution or commercial sex work. Here in South Florida, I can say that for whatever reason, the business model is kind of like split in half. So we have what we see as a quote unquote, and I'm loosely using quotes, your traditional Asian massage parlor business. So that business model here in South Florida is reflected as the majority of the employees that are working there are of Chinese descent, Chinese females, and I would say between 85 and 90% have a tie to Flushing, New York. They have a tie to Flushing, New York. They're coming down here, or that 10 to 15% is from the greater Los Angeles area. A lot of times the phone numbers that we were getting from them usually had like a 626 area code. The massage parlor business itself is that, a massage parlor. And in the state of Florida, and depending on where you are, jurisdiction-wise, it might differ. Here in South Florida, it differs because if you're open as a massage business, you fall under the regulations of the Department of Health. So that being said, the person or the owner of that said business has to have a massage license. They have to open up their businesses to Department of Health employees to conduct inspections. And like I had mentioned before, they're mostly Chinese and they usually reside within the location. That differs from the quote unquote spas, which provide the same prostitution or the sex act. For the most part, down here in South Florida, it's either Latina or US citizens. So in order to operate a spa in the state of South Florida, you need like a body wrap certificate or a spa license. So the regulations under that umbrella are less strict, and you fall under the Department of Business and Professional Regulations, not as stringent when it comes to inspections. So an owner of a place, if a Department of Health employee comes to do a check, they don't have to open the door because they don't fall under the jurisdiction of the Department of Health. All they have to do is have this body wrap certificate, which is like a 16-hour online course that you can get. And it's an easy certificate to get. Almost all of them are US citizens. They reside locally. They're not residing within the spa itself. In the Chinese massage parlor, the business model is the house or the business itself keeps the door fee. So, back in the day, it was pretty much fixed between $60 and $65 for the hour. The person comes in, they pay the $60 to $65 an hour. That goes straight to the business. Whatever is negotiated in the back end is what the employee keeps. And a lot of times, if they were residing within the location, they were also paying the owner a fee to reside within the location. In the spas, the house keeps that upfront fee and usually a portion of the tip out. So usually like the first $20 goes to the house per customer. through our investigation, we discovered not only do we have like the businesses itself, but there's like almost like a cottage industry that developed to support these businesses. So with the Chinese massage parlors, where you needed a legitimate massage license from the state of Florida in order to operate, we found this cottage business where they were actually able to fraudulently get these massage licenses, which caused a problem not only for the state of Florida, but frankly, nationwide. When you actually get a hold of a state of Florida massage license, many of the states within the United States has a policy to reciprocate. So if I have my license in the state of Florida, I move to the state of Texas, and I decide that I want to open up a massage parlor, I can turn, it's almost like a driver's license. I can turn in my massage license, the paperwork, the massage license, and apply for a Texas license. And Texas will give me one. And all of a sudden I look on paper as if I have a legitimate massage, license, and then go from there. So, it legitimately spread nationwide. We were having complaints from North Carolina saying that why are we getting this influx of Chinese nationals, all of them female, all of them with massage licenses from this particular school. So we knew at that point, it was like, wow, it was almost like Pandora's box. It was open and it was, affecting businesses nationwide. On top of that, we have the realtors. I mean, you have guys that are savvy that know how to flip the businesses. So if one business owner wants to sell to another business owner, he knows what city paperwork needs to get pulled, the county paperwork needs to get pulled. So they're flipping businesses left and right. As I had mentioned, there's a cottage industry in regards to massage licenses and actually the body wrap certificates also. You have the same accountants. Everyone's using the same accountants. If someone gets arrested, for the most part, they're using the same lawyers. And it's a lucrative business here in South Florida. I mean, it went from maybe a dozen in the early 2000s to well over a couple hundred now. So that's pretty much the business model that we're seeing here in South Florida. From my understanding, it's pretty much mirrored the same way throughout the United States.
Thank you. That's really helpful framing for this conversation. Detective Scaramucci, I'm hoping you can tell us about the process of investigating these businesses.
Yeah, they're unique compared to traditional investigations, in most trafficking venues. Typically what we're seeing in most trafficking, but especially within illicit massage, is what I like to call like a vice styled approach. And it's very much get in, do the undercover work. The potential victim will solicit some sex act. And then the officer will give a code word and everybody comes in, to save the day. So they all rush in generally and detain the women. Oftentimes conduct all their interviews. They may do it at times with victim service providers, there. Generally speaking, there's limited cooperation. And then ultimately the victims go to jail for prostitution, right? So it's really shifting that and doing all of the legwork on the front end. So being able to follow the finances, being able to track all of the digital forensics, all of the digital evidence on the front side to your trafficker. And then once you have your trafficker, kind of shifting. So I like to tell law enforcement, you should be doing a sex trafficking case through a labor trafficking lens, right? So you are investigating sex trafficking, but you're also investigating labor trafficking. And when we take that approach, we can start questioning our victims when we get to that point about hours of operation, pay, kind of like what Mike was just saying. How are you getting paid? What's the amount per massage? What's the amount per tip? And really investigating that end and using the evidence from our labor trafficking case to be the evidence in our human trafficking case. But I think the most important thing is just really working up a total, complete, thorough investigation, knowing who your trafficker is long beforehand. I like to tell law enforcement, when you get to the point of a search warrant, if all of the potential victims tell you that they don't want to talk to you, like if their only word is attorney, you should still be able to prove your case, and you should not be relying on them to do that for many reasons. But one, obviously, that's the most victim-centered thing to do, as well as to be able to tell a story on their behalf.
There's a lot to unpack there, and we're going to unpack different pieces of that as we go through this conversation. But I'm going to ask Chris about investigations outside of illicit massage. But before I do, I want to go back to Detective Ju for just a minute, because when we first spoke, you told me about something that was new to me. I hadn't heard about this before, which is John stops and using that as a way to get warrants. So can you talk a little bit about what those are and how you've been able to use John stops as a different style of operation from exactly what Detective Scaramucci was describing as the traditional vice op?
Absolutely. So luckily, we had a great working relationship with the city of Boca Raton, which is in Palm Beach County, just north of Broward County. The Palm Beach State Attorney's Office and Palm Beach in general had shifted away from that vice style that and I'll be honest with you, I was definitely guilty of back in 2013, because we didn't know what we were looking at. We were looking at what we believed was just like a small time prostitution operation. They knew what they were getting themselves into. They know it was illegal. So we're going in, making those arrests and basing pretty much our evidence investigation off of that arrest, off of the undercover operative going in there, soliciting either the prostitution or the massage act, and then basing the investigation off of the arrest there. Now, Palm Beach had decided, maybe through the lens of human trafficking, and maybe because of the way the community was looking at it, as why are we victimizing the victim, hypothetically? If you're going in there to try and prove a human trafficking case, why are you going in and potentially forcing that human trafficking victim to solicit a sex act from this law enforcement officer that's supposed to be on their side? So that kind of forced different agencies. And like I said, Boca Raton was pretty much, I mean, they were there at the spearhead. So they sat down and figured out, okay, let's try and reinvent the wheel. So they developed what was called John stops. Through the course of investigation and through the course of surveillance, they would identify a John leaving one of the massage parlors and conduct a traffic stop 2 to 3 miles away from the location. They had a form. These stops were conducted with usually a supervisor and a detective on scene, and they would go through questions in regards to the specific location. And they had a form. It was a great form, and you would just go down 1 through 10. How many times have you been here? Do you see the same person? How much do they charge? Who do you pay? They nailed off all of the things that you would need for a probable cause affidavit for a search warrant for that location, to try and identify who's making the money, where are their cameras, all the stuff that you need to build. And also in regards to the sex act, what typical sex act were you getting there? Did you have to ask for it? Was it offered? And how much it was? And at that point in the investigation, we were able to offer them a level of confidentiality. So at the bottom of it, we would say, listen, you can remain anonymous. You're going to sign the bottom of this affidavit. And it had at least like a notary stamp saying that you're giving this statement to me as a detective, as a law enforcement officer. My supervisor is here witnessing it. We're going to keep your name out of the report. And we would actually assign it if it was whatever, Tuesday, TM1, and we would keep it in our reports, keep it off in a confidential section, knowing that TM1 was John Doe. John Doe gave us a statement saying that on such and such a date, based off of our notes, that he entered spa XYZ. He paid $65 for the front. He paid another $30 for a hand job. And he regularly goes there and usually asks for the same person. So we're able to document that. Document 5 or 6. So at least with the state of Florida, for us, what we were developing probable cause for was to prove that the owners of the businesses were deriving support from the proceeds of prostitution, which in the state of Florida is our felony. So for the search warrant, that's what we required. We needed to prove that prostitution was happening within the location. So before the Robert Kraft scandal, this was the probable cause that we were able to develop into what was, known as quote unquote sneak and peek search warrants or covert surveillance search warrants. Based off of these John stops, I mean, literally we would do enough John stops, based off of their template. I was actually able to do 2 in Broward County, where based off of John stops, surveillance of the actual location, trash pulls, massage parlor ads, we were able to get covert surveillance search warrants saying that we needed to prove prostitution was occurring within these locations, and that the only way, because we don't want to send any undercover personnel in, that we would have to install the cameras. Now, obviously, that tool is being looked at under a microscope. However, if you're still doing a traditional money laundering type case, rather than like a human trafficking case, here in the state of Florida, based off of the John stops, we're still able to get enough probable cause to go into the brick and mortar storefront in order to get evidence out. And that's just based off of the John stops itself, to get financial records and to see if we can get the condoms inside the massage parlor, because obviously a legitimate massage parlor isn't going to have condoms. So based off of just the John stops, whether it's 5, 6, whatever the prosecutor feels comfortable with, we're able to use that as our evidence to get into the door to develop that probable cause for a search warrant for the storefront.
Thank you. So Chris, over to you. Can you tell us about investigations of other businesses in particularly impacting the API community?
Sure. And before I switch to that, I want to just touch base on a little bit the federal side of these investigations that Joseph and Mike are talking about. On the federal side, we find exactly that same type of operation, and where we kind of help in is where we can tie in federal money laundering charges. If there's transportation of women across state lines, we have Mann Act potential charges, and that can always supplement what we have. In Southern California, San Diego in particular, because San Diego is very different than Los Angeles, we have a large Asian American API community, but Asian American community in the sense that we have recent immigrants from China, Korea, but they aren't usually, San Diego is not usually their first stop. They'll have come in, they'll go to Los Angeles, San Francisco on the West Coast, and definitely in upstate New York, as Mike mentioned. By the time we encounter them at massage parlors that might be doing illicit business, they're usually far removed from their initial trafficking into the United States, and it's very difficult for us to have them, 1, admit that they're trafficking victims, and 2, implicate whomever they're with. So that then we start going down the route of, let's see if there's money laundering or at least transportation across state lines for purposes of prostitution. But some of the other things that we've been looking at and trying to focus on in particular in recent years are forced labor cases. And as I mentioned briefly, we had about 5 years ago a woman from Indonesia that had been working for a wealthy family in Dubai, and then sent to his family here in the San Diego area to work for them, really free of charge, 24 hours a day for several years. And because she happened to have legal documents because she was here on a work visa, but she certainly didn't speak English, was able to slip a note to another healthcare worker who happened to pass by the house saying, please help me. I'm here against my will. The healthcare person didn't know what to do with it, sent it to HSI, who had it translated. And then we went in and performed a rescue operation. We're able to get her out. A lot of times what we see, like in that case, is this woman is so grateful to get out and she just wants to go home. And we have to try to at least tell her, listen, we know you have no reason to trust law enforcement, much less federal law enforcement, but hang on a little bit. Let's see if we can get restitution for you at least. And in that case, we had the U.S. Department of Labor come in, their wage and hour division said, this is how much she's owed. Part of the plea agreement was a quick resolution, at least pay her this much, and she was able to go back home. Another case we have is similar in some regards. It's a forced labor case where a young woman from Vietnam was told to come here under the misrepresentation that she'd be working here and working towards her college education. But the allegation, because this is a case that's still pending, is that she was compelled to work in a nail salon. She had and not be paid, working overtime, and they were collecting all of her proceeds. We're seeing a lot of these, and similar to the first case, the reason we found that is there were some very nice clients of hers. She was able to learn enough English and tell her, listen, I don't think this is right, what's going on. And those clients went to law enforcement and finally made its way to us. So I think these are definitely the exceptions where the victims have the incredible bravery to say, hey, I'm a victim and get help. But we know the vast majority of the victims out there are not, are scared of their traffickers, are scared of law enforcement, may not be documented, or just don't know where to come forward. Even language barriers are a problem there. So we work with community-based organizations, NGOs, whomever we can, in addition to our state and local law enforcement partners, to try to find those cases. They're not going to come and land on our lap. And so it takes a constant active effort, and making allies with everyone in the nonprofit area to see, okay, this is what we'll do if and when you find the victims. So let us know, and then we'll work from there, whether we develop a prosecutable case, go state or federal, at least tell us where they are. We'll remove them from the situation and go from there.
Next, I want to turn to Jane and ask can you share with us some of the successful strategies you found for investigating and prosecuting these crimes?
Yeah, I think that everyone's sort of laying the foundation, which is that we haven't been doing this very well for a long time when it comes to the commercial front brothels, and particularly the illicit massage businesses. And part of that is because there's this tension, the tension between, getting calls from the community that you want to address, sort of that not in my backyard kind of thing, and then just not having the skills and victim services in place to really be effective doing outreach or connecting with potential victims that are working within these businesses. And so what we kind of had to do a couple of years ago is take a back step and say, okay, we've been conducting these investigations. I think we can admit that the goals of any investigation are to, identify potential victims, arrest the bad guys, and dismantle the networks that we know are behind them. And we basically were failing spectacularly in all three fronts. So then the idea is, okay, what can we do? And so I think the successes that we've been starting to see are successes where we look at these cases as organized crime, as a networked business that is committing all sorts of financial fraud, tax evasion, and things like that. And so that's kind of where we've been pushing the field over the last couple of years. And in connection with many of you guys on the call, I know we've been involved in this. And so it's kind of trying to take it from different angles. Number one, really looking at digital evidence, financial evidence, and then also building up our ability to competently provide meaningful services to the victims or potential victims that we are identifying. So that's a big missing piece of our response over the years that I think we really need to focus on. Sometimes you talk to law enforcement and prosecutors, they're like, we're not, social workers. That's not our job. And I can understand that mentality, but the truth of the matter is we're not going to be able to do our jobs if we don't really focus on that piece. And so that's really where I say we need to be spending some time and effort and building up the capacity in our communities and those folks that we work with already that are providing great services. Let's try to get some, culturally appropriate services put in place, language access, immigration relief, those types of things.
Those are such important points, and we're going to come back to that. I know Chris touched on that too, of supporting victims and survivors. We'll come back to that in just a minute. Before I do, we do have some questions that have come in from our audience that I want to get to because they're great questions. And I'm going to tee this up for Detective Scaramucci, but I also think Detective Ju or any of the other panelists may want to weigh in on this too. Which essentially, Teresa Lupo is asking about kind of how is it that you were able to shut down all the businesses in Waco, Texas, and yet we know so many areas. She specifically mentions Flushing, which is, I think, really the epicenter of this issue of illicit massage businesses. But in San Diego, in Los Angeles, like I know for a fact, we see businesses all over the place that we suspect may be illicit massage businesses. And so, how is it that you were able to be successful? And I guess what are the challenges? What are the barriers that are keeping other cities from being able to shut down these businesses entirely?
I think that's a multi-pronged answer, so I'll try to keep it fairly short. For one, improper law enforcement investigations, right? Doing the whole vice thing. Fine. You go arrest them for a misdemeanor offense. The ladies that are arrested will be put back to work in 2 hours. If they're not, they'll be on a flight back to Queens, and 2 other women, will be on a flight from Queens. So that's one reason. When you look at a lot of what's going on in Flushing, I mean, it's overwhelming, right? We've run numerous search warrants in Flushing, and every time it takes about 10 minutes for it to be very painfully obvious who the police are. So you've got that going on. When we do things to push, right? There was just an article out of Myrtle Beach that was referencing pushing the illicit businesses out. So they're not our problem anymore, right? Well, they may not be, but they're your neighbor's problem. So really doing this whole wash my hands of it, it's not my issue, improper arrests, those are all things that are working against us. I know there's a big push to kind of get eviction, right? So I'll get you evicted from this strip mall. Well, that's fine. We can say that we ended it in said strip mall building, but when they opened 3 cities away, it did nothing to deter a thing. So there's a million different things we could get into. I will also caution that there's a lot of analytical views about IMB trafficking that are kind of not what they appear. So more often than not, if I work with especially state or federal agency, a lot of times they'll come out with like some grand map of 4 million people combined that are this huge network of operatives or whatever. And it's often not that. So, we look at Flushing and we look where people are going to start, touching each other and how they're associated. It doesn't necessarily mean that they're organized crime, right? I know my neighbors. I spend certain amounts of time at a certain taqueria with certain people. It doesn't mean we're all networked. It just means we have many common interests and we're neighbors and we do all these things together. So a lot of that gets confusing and overwhelming. And, unfortunately, we deal a lot too. We're law enforcement on a state or local level. This is where I'm very blessed. I can say, hey, look, I need to go to Queens to run search warrants, and my boss puts me on a flight. A lot of times they're just like, hey, we've got this. It all comes back to Flushing, and they, for some reason, think it's a very unique thing. And they maybe forward it to Queens North Vice, and we're done. They're at the epicenter there in Queens, and I'm sure it's overwhelming to deal with every agency in the country coming back to you, saying, hey, everything's stemming from here. So how do you even, that's tough.
And just to kind of piggyback what Joe said, I mean, Joe was very successful in his jurisdiction to be able to close them down. I was lucky enough to work with one of our local detectives out of the city of Hallandale Beach, and they had put a major push in regards to closing down the illicit massage parlor businesses within the city. But it took that detective, not only his team, but dedicated hours and hours of surveillance, repurposing a potentially a VIN, a vice intelligence and narcotics squad to hammer down on this position. But then he would have to do the follow-up in regards to the city council meetings. and speak with the city attorney to try and get these businesses closed down, their licenses revoked, and everything like that. And what ended up happening was, just like Joe said, okay, well, we're going to close down in Hallandale, so we're just going to open up across the street in Hollywood. So legitimately, that's what ended up happening, was they closed the business in Hallandale, they opened it in Hollywood, literally right across the street. Another problem too is, I was speaking with the detective up in North Carolina, and what ended up happening is they were relatively successful in shutting down the brick and mortar stores. So they actually ended up moving into apartments. So now all of a sudden you have a different threshold of whereas in the state of Florida, it's a little easier for me to get a search warrant for a storefront business because it's a business. People are coming in and out. There's no quote unquote expectation of privacy. There's no quote unquote castle doctrine. When you move into a house and trying to get a search warrant for a residence, your threshold of what you need to get into that house, that probable cause threshold, some prosecutors might look at it a little bit differently than a storefront. And then now it's multiplying. So now you no longer know that, okay, I'm going down the street, strip mall, business A, B, and C. I know they're engaging in some type of illicit business. Now it's spread amongst the community. Now all of a sudden, is it apartment A? Is it apartment B? Is it apartment C? So those were some of the long view problems that we started looking at, where if we started, and it's unfortunately, and I hate to say it's a manpower issue, and I not say it until I'm blue in the face, and I hate to say and blame. I mean, this is definitely something that needs to get addressed. It's important because it does victimize so many people, but there are so many businesses and there's only so many allocated resources to be able to try and stem that problem.
Super helpful. Does anyone else have anything they want to add on that before I transition to a different question? That actually, Detective Ju, is the perfect segue into my next question for Chris, which is, what do you do if there are limited resources? What are things that law enforcement and prosecution can do? Because that's often something, we hear is, well, these are really complicated. These are very expensive. This takes a lot of manpower. What can prosecutors and investigators do with limited resources?
As I mentioned before, it requires preparation before the cases come. You really have to have your partnerships with some of your local organizations that cater towards victims, so that even if you don't go forward on a case, they'll have access to resources. We're lucky we work with the local district attorney's office, and both their office and our office have very active victim witness coordinators who are tied into some of the resources available for victims. And it's both a blessing and a curse that we have so many trafficking cases in Southern California, but because of that, we're also very tuned to what resources are available and can have those options. We also have the unique position being on the border. We encounter a lot of immigration issues with trafficking. So we work closely with our agents on HSI. They're very active in our human trafficking task force, and they can provide, they can help usher through what's a very difficult system to obtain temporary protective status for trafficking victims when they're helping out on an investigation. And then of course there's the potential for a visa down the road, whether it's a T or a U visa, and that doesn't require a actual prosecution or conviction, as long as they're participating, they're assisting in an investigation. So that's always helpful. And then the last thing, because we've been doing it for a while, we work with a lot of criminal defense attorneys and immigration attorneys who know the process, so that they can kind of usher them in. And when we have to, if we have to shift focus to the prosecution, those attorneys, if they're appointed in federal court as a material witness attorney, or even just through some of our NGOs, they can help provide those resources and identify them for the victims. So we're not totally wed to having a prosecution or even an indictment. If we can remove someone from a dangerous situation, of course, that's the first priority. And then we'll find the resources. As long as they come forward, we can send them in the right direction. But we're always learning. There's always more resources and more issues that we've never seen, but at least we've got it started.
Thanks, Chris. Jane, my next question is for you. You know, in response to kind of the aftermath of the Atlanta shootings, there's been a lot of discussion about anti-Asian racism, xenophobia, and I'm curious to know, when we're talking about prosecution, investigation, prosecution of these businesses, particularly businesses often employing the API community, impacting the API community, you know, how does racism factor into which cases are investigated and prosecuted and which ones are not?
Thank you so much for asking that question, because I don't think we can have this conversation without acknowledging that these cases are often thought of and dealt with in a very different way than all of our other human trafficking cases. Now, some of that is because of how they're set up, right? But we have to acknowledge that there is racism and historical over-eroticism of the Asian women that have led to us being able to say those women are not as worthy of our resources and our attention. Those women don't look like our mother, our daughters, and our sisters, which is often what we hear from politicians and folks that are trying to get buy-in for thinking about human trafficking in our communities, right? Oh, this could be your sister, this could be your mother. And I think racism really does lend itself to us being able to other the women that are victimized within illicit massage businesses and other commercial front businesses that are employing and exploiting Asian women. So I know it's like a difficult conversation to have, but if you just think about the jokes that you have grown up with and you still see around us about Asian massage parlors, even the fact that we call them Asian massage parlors or illicit massage businesses, you know, we do know that there's this large percentage, and so some of it's just based on, you know, what we see and what we do. But I was in the Dallas airport. Now, it's been a while since I've been flying, but there is an Asian restaurant there. And when I looked at the menu, they had their dessert offerings listed under the title Happy Endings. That's how ingrained this is in our culture. And that's based on our being able to dehumanize and other the women that are working and being exploited within these businesses. So we really need to take a look when we ask ourselves, well, these are really resource intensive cases. So therefore we're triaging, we're deprioritizing, but we would never do that if the victims involved were white girls. And that's what I would say about that.
Thank you. It's so important. Amy, I see you raising your hand. I don't know if you wanted to jump in here and add anything to the conversation. We'd love to hear from you as well. And for those who attended our last trainings, you've already heard from Amy, and just an incredible expert in this space as well.
Hi, I raised my hand by accident. I really just meant to hit like applause to Jane thank you so much for saying that. Just I couldn't have said it better. So thank you. I actually was going to answer one of the questions that did come into the chat, which may not be the perfect segue from what Jane was saying, but just on the question about restitution. And Chris, please correct me if I'm wrong, but my understanding is if the defendant is convicted on a severe form of trafficking in persons per the TVPA, then there's mandatory restitution. And that amount is based on the victim's losses. And per my understanding of the statute, it also can include lost wages, which can be wages from prostitution itself. Despite that being in the statute, I don't know of many clients in our organization that actually get that money, often because one, the actual conviction isn't based on the TVPA definition of the crime, or that the assets are actually not locatable. And so despite there being restitution orders for many of our clients, I am not aware of my clients getting all that much from it, but it is a remedy that is available.
Yeah, basically the answer is yes to all the above. The restitution is mandatory in those cases. There's also, and this is speaking on the federal side, there's a mandatory special assessment of $5,000 that's totally unrelated to restitution in these types of cases, and that could be going towards victim funds. We, in the TVPA of 2000, it's also really broadened what we can seize as evidence, not as evidence, but seize as proceeds of these crimes that we can then sell and use that as restitution, whether it's a house where they've harbored somebody, the massage parlor business, anything like that. And we have had a little bit of success, at least when we have an established brick and mortar business, to find some kind of form of restitution, whether it's substitute proceeds or the money there. But yeah, sometimes that is the most important part, as I said earlier, is getting out of the place and getting some kind of form of recompense. And the conviction is important for us and to show to the public for deterrent effect, but for the victim, that restitution is much more important. But we do have a lot of ways to track down proceeds and property that they might have.
Thank you, Chris and Amy, both for your answers on that. I want to go back to one kind of follow-up question for my question to Jane about racism, and any of the panelists are welcome to answer this one. Is one of the forms of racism that comes up is people stereotyping all Asian massage businesses as being illicit, right? And that's something that we have very much seen in the Atlanta cases of people just making that assumption from the get-go without actually knowing if these businesses were even offering illicit services. So my question to all of you is, one, as community members, how can people, I guess, one, kind of what is advice you have in terms of checking our stereotypes at the door and understanding that not all Asian massage businesses are illicit, understanding that some illicit massage businesses are not Asian run or Asian operated, and are there signs that community members can look for to if we are looking to, like, we want to report businesses that we think are illicit businesses to law enforcement and be helping with the problem? We see things in our community and we're suspicious. I guess, what are signs to look for, and what are things that maybe we see that maybe aren't a sign that we think it might be?
I can hit on that real quick. I know from our end, so we do run into that, right? We get people calling, they're like, hey, there's human trafficking, there's this Chinese massage parlor. And I'm like, well, at any given time, if you see me walking in there off duty, it's because it's not illicit, right? I enjoy getting a massage. So it's kind of, we do run into that at times. A lot of what I just tell people is what you would find in most places. If at 9 a.m. they're kicking on the lights from the inside, the FBI calls that a clue, right? We have a problem. If they're never leaving, if somebody comes and delivers groceries, the really heavy surveillance, as an example, the one that I go to doesn't have 400 cameras outside pointing at every angle. So just some of the more basic things. The most important, I really think, and the most obvious, is sit outside for an hour. And if it's nothing but a bunch of middle-aged white dudes walking in and out, that's kind of a red flag. Most regular massage businesses that are involved in, just normal day-to-day operations, the overwhelming majority of the clientele is going to be female. I mean, that just is what it is. So when we're seeing nothing but a bunch of guys walking in and out, and at times staying 15 minutes, those would be some of the more red flags that we're seeing, and that I would really ask our public to report and come forward on.
And to piggyback off of what Joe said, absolutely. With your surveillance, if you're sitting there and you just see a bunch of men coming and going, as a community member or as a law enforcement officer, or as just a person, if you're a female and you walk in and the employees literally don't know what to do, they're speechless, like what's going on, that's usually a red flag. I mean, I've had a couple of people approach me and say, listen, I walked into spa 123 and they literally did not know what to do. Like speechless, they didn't even engage them in, oh, would you like to get a massage? That just like we would call a hint. So that's one of the huge, huge flags to look for.
That's really helpful. Actually, I have a follow-up question of things that I've been told that I want to fact check if they are things that we should be looking for. Things like having, the whole front page, the front, front of the place being totally blacked out where you can't see in or out, having very late operating hours, open till midnight kind of thing. Are those signs, or are those, is it not a sign?
I would say it's a sign.
I think those are definitely, yeah, I would too. And one thing I want to caution that just came up in a recent meeting is it's not any particular thing, right? It's not if this is there, if they're open till 11 midnight, whatever, it means trafficking. It's the totality of everything, right? So when we start combining multiple, different segments, then that's when we start really going, oh, this is a problem, not one in and of itself.
That's a really important point. I'm glad you mentioned that. All right, I want to shift gears a little bit and talk about being victim-centered and trauma-informed. The title of this training is a survivor-centered approach to these investigations and prosecutions. And I want to talk about what it means to be trauma-informed, what it means to be victim-centered. I'm going to start with Detective Scaramucci, but I would love anybody to provide their input on what exactly those two terms are thrown around a lot. We talked a lot about that in our prep. Of a lot of people say victim-centered and trauma-informed. What does that really mean truly? And what is, if somebody says that they want their agency to be victim-centered and trauma-informed, what does that actually entail?
Okay, hear me out. So I really hate the term victim-centered in law enforcement. I do not like it. I think it's become a buzzword, right? We support investigations where they say this person is victim-centered. He knows what's best. Well, we don't know what's best, right? So when we just look at victim-centered on the surface, and I'll speak only to the law enforcement side because that's what I do. Victim-centered is exactly what it says, right? We're putting the victim in the middle of this, and we're doing all these things in their best interest. I argue that we as law enforcement should not be victim-centered. I feel like we have to be trauma-informed and trauma-sensitive. I say trauma-sensitive because you can teach somebody to be trauma-informed, but if they're a jerk, they're a jerk. It doesn't matter. And from the law enforcement side, I try to look at it, let's get away from victim-centered and let's look at offender-focused, right? So on my end, my job is to put the offender at the absolute center of this bubble and focus all my attention on their bad acts. While that's going on, I have to be cognizant of the fact that there are NGOs over here that are being victim-centered, that are working for the complete holistic response for that victim, and we have to meet in the middle of what's trauma-informed, right? And we have to meet together to be able to help one another. But if we look at this from the checklist, are we victim-centered? It's really tough for cops because, again, we walk in with almost, and I hate to completely shift, but we walk in with a special victims type investigation. And if we take a total special victims type investigation, generally speaking, say in a sexual assault, the whole burden of that investigation really is on outcry, cooperation of the victim, and we're not seeing that in these venues. So all the bad acts around the offender, and then also understanding all the rest and just meeting in the middle on those is, I think, very, very important. One of the most important, especially in these venues, is cultural competency, right? So we neglect that. And as an example, and I'm in Waco, Texas, people. So when I say that if we can find people who can do this, you can too. When we walk into an illicit massage parlor, right? We're going to do this warrant. So we're going to go in, we're going to make contact, and we have NGOs and we have service providers, and they are just chomping at the bit to do good things. And they come in and they've got a bag of Chick-fil-A for all of the potential victims because we're going to feed them. And you have a bunch of, 23-year-old Caucasian college educated girls who are just going to hoorah and make everybody feel good. It's not going to work out. It's just not. So really understanding cultural competency and coming in with, things like tea and just all the traditional foods that we want to feed people and we want to help take care of them, but also with NGOs and organizations that are there that understand what that means and aren't going to walk in with the, hey, I know what every American wants, therefore we're going to help you. And having even things as simple as translators on site. If I'm ever arrested in another country, and as an example, we were in an Asian country working some of these cases, the last thing I would have ever wanted was to be arrested and get a phone call from somebody speaking English with that particular country's accent. I would be horrified as to what was potentially going on. So even bringing some of our translators on site there with us and making sure that they have a face-to-face with somebody who understands cultural competency and how to further these investigations and really going back to the victim-centered on their end, meeting all those victim-centered responses from that side.
And if I could, just to piggyback off of what Joe said, having someone face-to-face, someone that's culturally competent is huge, because when we were first doing our investigation, we thought we were doing the right thing. We had federal agents, we had other people there to assist us, the victim advocates. And when we were trying to communicate with our people, with our potential victims, you're trying to communicate through a cell phone sitting in the middle of the room and everyone trying to talk. And then worst of all, sometimes it's the wrong dialect. So, talk about adding injury to insult or insult to injury, you're not even talking to the correct audience. The couple of times, and I'll be honest with you, a handful of times that we were actually able to get victim statements or victim cooperation, we were actually able to source a young female Chinese from one of our local churches, and she agreed to come and assist us. And she was able to bridge that cultural gap where we weren't able to pick up on some of the physical nuances. There's a chance that maybe that quote unquote verbal translation was maybe 100% on the phone, because maybe that was the best that we had at the time. But when you had someone in that room, you actually have a human being actually speaking with the person, actually able to engage, which is kind of potentially what the traffickers are always using, right? They're trying to use that, hey, we're connected because we look the same, we speak the same language, you can trust me. Well, who's to say that we can't use that same instrument to foster that, our trust? So, does it take a couple of extra steps? Yes. Does it take a couple of extra steps to know what your audience is going to be prior to making that contact? Yeah. But, you talk to anyone, you're able to try and figure out the dialect of the people that are working within that business. Try and figure that out before you go ahead and recruit someone within the community or within, your either a federal agency, or if you're lucky enough to have a, Chinese speaking person within your agency, make sure that you have that hammered out before you bring the wrong person to the wrong dance, pretty much is what it comes down to.
I just want to piggyback there, because this is obviously really great for providing victim services to come in with that level of cultural humility. But it's also important for us to build our cases. So if we're building a case based on force, fraud, and coercion, most of the time we're really focused on that coercion piece, right? Well, coercion is an individualized analysis, right? So it's based on who the victim is, their vulnerabilities, the totality of the circumstances, and their background. If you look at that, that means we have to be able to articulate as attorneys, as investigators, if we're writing our reports or affidavits, why this coercion was effective on this victim. And if we don't understand that cultural background, then we're not going to be able to articulate it. And I think that's why a lot of times these cases end up being pled out to something less than, because we're not doing a good job. So we need to be culturally humble. We need to engage with those that can teach us sort of these cultural aspects that are, to me, very foreign. Americans are very individual spirits. A lot of Asian cultures are collective. Now, I can understand that on maybe an intellectual basis, but if you don't really take the time to understand a little bit further about what it actually means to live in a collective culture and what it means to your entire family, and what this coercive aspect of exactly what Detective Ju said, the traffickers are using those cultural coercive tactics. We need to be able to understand it and articulate it. Like, I'm your brother. Why would you ever go to the police? I've helped you. That's a stronger coercive tactic to maybe somebody in some of these cultural backgrounds than maybe it would be to me.
Can I add one thing real quick to what Jane said? On an investigative level, one thing that we found, right, because we're cops, we're human lie detectors. The moment we meet you, we know if you're lying. To have that literal conversation on the phone back and forth with translation, a lot of times we'll end up with the cops going, oh, she's lying, because they don't understand the cultural context of what's being told. So as soon as she's lying, now all bets are off. Now she's a criminal, right? So that's so much more important too, is that you have somebody that can sit there with you and say, this is the literal, statement. This is what she probably means. This is the context for it. Because then while that active investigation is going on, you're like, okay, she's not lying. That's not sister. That's not this literal person. That's not all of these things that we know are different. This is why she is saying that.
So true. A follow-up question on that is, I know Detective Drew mentioned, bringing somebody from the community to help, on these operations. And I'm curious, balancing both the desire to have somebody who truly is culturally competent, who's there in the room, but also somebody who either one, like, will not pass judgment, who really understands human trafficking. And I wonder if you've had any issues kind of having that backfire of having somebody from the community come in and translate, and what are some of the, in a perfect world, obviously, again, limited resources, we do what we can. And I assume it's better to have somebody in the room than on a phone anytime. But if we're in the perfect world looking for our ideal translator, what are the things that people should be looking for in a translator when they're working on these cases and helping you with them? Chris, do you want to go ahead?
Yeah, I was going to piggyback on what everyone was saying. As far as from the prosecution side, you really have to be the person in the middle, coordinating the law enforcement approach and the NGO approach when they're there. And to your point, Jamie, there was an infamous case. It was a federal prosecution out of Berkeley and Oakland that involved trafficking of women from India, and they had to get an interpreter quickly, and that interpreter wasn't really well versed, first of all, in the issues, but most importantly in the law enforcement restrictions. And she ended up tainting all of the evidence. She would interview one of the victims, and when everyone was aside, and say, hey, are you sure you want to say that? So-and-so said this. Don't you think that that's what happened? And all the convictions had to be thrown out and started from scratch. So those are just some of the things that happen. And so it's really incumbent upon the prosecution team and the prosecutor in particular to make sure you have a good coordination between of professionals on all ends, people that know how to deal with victims with that trauma-centered approach. And you have to be sensitive to that in the prosecution. You have to make sure all those needs are being taken care of, whether it's something as simple as change of clothes. If they're found in illicit massage parlor, they probably just have skimpy clothing. If they're underage, they need to have education, much less food and shelter. And then once the criminal charges are filed, the prosecution really has to concentrate on the constitutional rights of the defendant, and you can't be there as a personal attorney for the victim but you're also not going to let that fall through the cracks. That's when you really have to rely on your partners on the NGO side, the victim protection side. But all those considerations are important to think about beforehand, because I've seen it when you have to really invent the plane while you're flying, and it's much more difficult. You got to do it ahead of time.
Really important.
And just,
we have a lot of, oh, go ahead.
oh, I'm sorry, just, I apologize, just to kind of piggyback what Chris said in regards to when you're speaking with, we vetted this person, at least in our case, and we were, I mean, it was just maybe a handful of times with one person, but we vetted her, consistently. And one thing that I think was probably important was that we recorded all of the statements. Anytime we were in the same room together, it was recorded, and we ended up having those recordings reviewed by a third-hand party, which was one of the, HSI approved translators, to make sure that there wasn't any huge discrepancies, kind of like what Chris had mentioned in the federal court case, where all of a sudden it's red flags, where it's, she's guiding her to say this, like, no, don't you mean this, because you'll, can get immigration status or something like that. So we made sure that, everything was recorded, and we tried to get it reviewed almost as soon as possible. So that way, if there were obstacles or there were, red flags, we'd be able to identify it in the beginning.
That is really important. I'm so glad you mentioned that. We have some really great questions in the Q&A that I want to get to. I have 2 more questions that I want to ask before we get to those. So I'll try to ask our panelists to be relatively brief in your answers, only because I want to get to all these questions. I have so many I want to ask you all. So one question is, we have a lot of service providers on this call or on this Zoom, and I'm interested to know from all of you, what can we do to work better with law enforcement? What are kind of the do's and don'ts? What have you seen really successful? What have you seen not work? What really frustrates you that service providers might do? I know we have different interests, right? Our interest as service providers is our client, is we are victim centered, right? We are survivor centered, and law enforcement operations are offender centered. So if anybody who wants to can just touch on kind of the do's and don'ts, how we can work better together. Yeah.
On the law enforcement side, always bring breakfast and coffee. No, so the cops, right? Here's the deal. What we're doing is not top secret. Nothing's top secret. So get over yourself. Invite your NGOs into briefings. One thing, just looking back at just like basic Marine Corps leadership, if I don't know what I'm actually working for, I don't know how to get there. So if you bring in the NGOs and they have full picture of what's going on, now I'm not saying hand them criminal histories, but if you give them full picture as to what's going on, they can help build their own plan to help your investigation too. And we have to get over this level of arrogance that law enforcement has, right? Our egos are as big as my hat. And what we have to remember is that if we empower our NGOs to do better for us, they're building out better cases for us. So it works both ways. As far as NGOs are concerned, I don't see it as much as I do from the cops, but we all have to remember we're on the same highway, but we're in our own lane. And there are times where we have to be very courteous and let somebody come over a little bit. But I did see an NGO one time telling a cop who they were going to arrest. And obviously that didn't work out too well in their favor. I would just say that understand that your role is so important as an NGO or service provider, but it's not the only role. It's a support role. And my job is a support role for you, right? So we're all just trucking along in the same stretch of highway, supporting each other. And if some of those conversations have to be had at happy hour or at dinner or somewhere away where we're going to hash out all of our disagreements and figure out what we can do better in a debrief, then all for it. But definitely just understanding that each other are going to supplement and help each other. And if we can both kind of uplift each other, it's going to have a tremendous effect on most importantly, what kind of care we can get for the victims, but then B, secondly, as important is putting bad people in prison.
Jane, I saw your mute was off. Did you have something you wanted to add to that?
No, I was just going to say that these are the conversations that you have to have in advance. If you're on scene or you're in the middle of an operation and you're trying to figure out, who's doing what, it's never going to work out well. So I love the idea of a happy hour, but it can also just be a meeting in advance. And then identify, where your anticipated tension points are. Also vet the organizations that you work for or you're working with, excuse me, because there are some organizations out there that really maybe mean well, but don't have the expertise necessary to be involved in this work. So vet the organizations to the level that you can have some level of trust and comfort, then have conversations, identify what you expect those tension points to be, because historically, the reason why law enforcement, prosecutors, and victim service professionals do have maybe sometimes come to heads is because we haven't done it well in the past. And so we're bringing that historical sort of pieces of like, whether we thought victim service professionals were being obstructionist, or we thought they were talking victims out of reporting. That was real things that I felt as a prosecutor on occasion. So I have to like put that on the table well in advance of the work we're going to be doing and have those conversations, and then get to the point of, okay, this is how we feel comfortable in our lanes, and this, and then debrief after an operation and talk about, okay, this went really well. What could I have done better? What could we have done better? And then keep working towards that goal.
So my next question, I'm going to combine my question with one of the questions from one of our attendees. My question is, have you worked with lawmakers to improve the laws? And tell us a little bit about what you've done if you have. And combine with that, if anybody is able to touch specifically on the Closing the Law Enforcement Consent Loophole Act. For anybody who's seen that, it has to do with law enforcement engaging in sexual activities with, I believe it's off-duty law enforcement, but it may also be on duty. I'm not sure. But if you could talk about how that might affect IMB businesses and these vice operations.
So in regards to, all right, so just in regards to the lawmakers, at least for me here in South Florida, luckily, because of the unit that I'm in, internet crimes against children and child exploitation, a lot of times our unit gets asked almost like this, where you develop maybe ability to speak on certain subjects. So luckily, human trafficking is a hot topic. Luckily, child exploitation, and not to say luckily, like, oh, this is the greatest thing. It's just because there's more attention drawn to these subjects. I've been lucky enough to be able to kind of be in the same pool with the same lawmakers on a regular basis. So you get to recognize each other's names. You get to recognize like, hey, I'm doing a panel discussion on digital media safety, especially when like COVID started, can we speak to someone in regards to that? Okay, raise my hand, I'll be that person. We need someone to speak about child exploitation and human trafficking. Boom, raise my hand, I'll start speaking. So that way you start developing a relationship. At least I was lucky enough to be able to develop a relationship with not only maybe that lawmaker, but that lawmaker's staff. That's your gatekeeper. As soon as you start building that relationship with, that staff person that's, arranging a lot of these interviews or these panel discussions, you're able to open up that dialogue. So I was lucky enough with one of our local state senators, Lauren Book, to try and, work, and Jane's, smiling because, she's obviously Lauren Book she's a foundation for, and she's a champion for a lot of the child exploitation that's happening, she's trying to champion a lot of efforts for them, on behalf of the child victims. So we were able to, spitball ideas back and forth. In the state of Florida, at least with our children, we're trying to push forward legislation so that way victims of human trafficking don't need to be deposed. State of Florida, for whatever reason, is still one of those states that holds on to this, like, hey, we need to depose our victims, witnesses, anyone involved in the case. For anyone in the legal loop knows, depositions are almost like a crucifixion. Prior to even stepping forward into trial, it's a daunting obstacle to try and overcome. So this was one of the discussions that we had with Senator Book, like, hey, can we try and modify legislation so that way we can change this? So obviously, the more conversations you have, the more times you get to interact. You can start voicing your concerns about what's going on in the community and human trafficking, and open up that dialogue to try and come up with with hopefully with, some type of either a legislative solution or something that, that would help the community, not only on a short term, but a long term.
On ours,
another
we work a
thing-
lot.
Oh.
Go ahead.
No, go ahead. It's okay. Okay.
No, I was just going to echo the same. Bye.
Zoom moments. So we have we have a lot of questions, and I know we're not going to get to all of them, but I want to get to as many as I can. There's a question about victims' rights attorneys and working with them. Do you allow them in your meetings if a victim comes forward to report their trafficking? I've heard from a lot of other lawyers that they, depending on the law enforcement agency, have a lot of challenges, doing their work as the victim's attorney on these cases.
We do. Yeah, I was just kind of answering this on the side with Amy. We absolutely do, right? Because it's total package. We want everything to be as great for our victim as we can, because that's ultimately what's going to lead to victim cooperation. One thing that we've also found, at least here locally, is the more that we work with the immigration attorneys and they work with our victims and we all work together, the more apt they are to waive that attorney-client privilege and show up with their attorney and provide statements and go through like all of their, obviously within reason, the immigration attorneys aren't just going to give us everything, but it does, again, going back to working with NGOs, really jumpstart our investigations, because now we have the immigration attorney and the victim willing to come and help out because they know all of the things that are beneficial to their their immigration rights.
I was going to jump in real quick, going to this question and a couple before. This is one of the important issues where the prosecution really has to be careful to steer everything the right way. Yes, have a victim's attorney come in, but you really have to explain to them what your role is, not to tell them do this and don't do this. Say, this is what I have to do as a prosecution. And also to give them fair warning, you're not a witness, and so don't become a witness. If you're there to protect the needs of your client, but don't be a liaison between them and me and say, hey, she said this happened to her, and give you more information. It's like, no, let me get it from the victim, because you don't want to be a witness and be called up on the stand. And also explain to them, this is going back to an issue a couple questions ago, let them know that as a prosecution, we have to disclose every benefit we give to a victim, which is fine. But know that if that victim ends up testifying at trial, one of the first questions on cross-examination is going to be, you're testifying on behalf of the government because they're going to give you all these benefits, and because they've given you all these benefits. If the victim attorney knows that, you don't have to tell them, hey, tell your client this and this. They'll know that and educate their victim to say, listen, the prosecutor's not going to promise you things in exchange for your testimony. I, as your independent representative, know these things are potentially available. And so you avoid having those kind of conversations and making those promises as a prosecutor. But you really have to keep the victim's attorney aware of not only the rights of the victim, but what might be the pitfalls in the eventual prosecution.
Yeah, I agree. I think it's all about, again, having those conversations ahead of time, because if the victim attorney is there, it does definitely raise some challenges later on, right? So that's things that we have to disclose. That's potential litigation over whether that attorney is now a witness to our case, to a statement. It can complicate the situation. But at the end of the day, I always say defer to the victim, their autonomy in their decision about whether they want that person in the room, but with a full understanding of the potential consequences. And similarly with, our obligation for Giglio and Brady, I frankly am like, okay, your defense theory is that this person's testifying because I gave them hot tea and clothes. Like, go for that. Let me talk about why I needed to do that. So I think it's all about planning, having the conversations in advance, and then having a strategy about how we're going to address it at court. We don't want to be making decisions that negatively impact our victim based on our case. So again, that's kind of that place where we can be victim-centered and think about, okay, ultimately, we're going to do what's right for the victim and what they decide, but let's do it in a very knowing fashion and then strategize.
Super helpful. I appreciate all of our panelists are also responding to questions real time in the Q&A. So thank you all for your great answers to these questions so we can get as many answered as possible. There's a question about on the law enforcement side, are they trained on victim offender intersectionality in human trafficking? How do they respond when the lines are blurry and someone has been victimized but may also be engaged in criminal behavior or even violations of trafficking laws? Really important question. Thank you for asking that.
This is the big gray area, right? I see Jay kind of chuckling. I
How much
think
time do
every
we
single
have?
case has, yeah, short answer, every single case has to be evaluated by its own merits, right? So if you were trafficked for a day and then all of a sudden after that day you become like number 2 in command and start beating people and you know, like all of this crazy nonsense for the last year and a half, there's probably a pretty good chance you're going to be treated accordingly. But as far as I'm concerned, we treat everybody who's not the actual trafficker as a victim, and then from there we go. So I try to look at it as like a sliding scale almost, and just how far are we going to get with this? And then if it gets to a point that we have to hold somebody criminally accountable in some way, then we obviously work with our district attorney or our U.S. attorney's office to determine maybe if we can do something lesser included or something completely not sexual related or any number of other options if we get to the point that we have to.
I think this is like the biggest topic that we get requests about, and it's not just in the context of illicit massage businesses, but in trafficking altogether. I think we have like 4 minutes left, so I'm going to just put in a webinar that Equitas put out. It's called Assessing Culpability, Context Before Conviction. I think it's a great primer to have this conversation, but I want to acknowledge that it's one of the more difficult things that law enforcement and prosecutors handle. And I agree with the approach of let's start off with thinking this person is exploited and victimized, and then let's get as much information as we can, getting input from other victims, from witnesses, from their own background, from how long they've been there, what their age is, what other exploitation have they experienced in their life. It's a really large scale sort of analysis that needs to be done.
Complicated question with not a whole lot of time to answer, but really important. Thank you for asking that. I know we have just a few minutes left, so I would love to just give our panelists an opportunity to make some closing remarks. Maybe if there's some point that you would hope to touch on today that you didn't have an opportunity to, this is your chance to say anything you'd like to contribute to this conversation before we wrap up.
One final point I'd like to make, Jamie, just on piggybacking on your idea of the problem of institutional racism, if not overt racism, that keeps us from doing these cases. It's also we've always had this issue where someone might be worried that the victims are here undocumented, and of course, with the API community, even if they're here legally, there's the idea that they're foreign. So we do have to train our law enforcement, at least let them know ahead of time. Look, you're gonna run into institutional pushback on the prosecution side, on the community side, on every side. Try to devote more resources, or at least more attention to these cases that aren't getting attention because there's not the public outcry or the constituency that's pounding on your door. Those are the cases that are getting overlooked more often and the ones that need more attention.
I know closing on ours, we're a 2-man at best unit, right? So if your law enforcement's telling you that, hey, we can't do this, we don't have the manpower or resources, don't accept that for an answer. Definitely refer them to us. We can walk them through how to do this with 2 to 3 people. It's completely doable. The other thing that I run into a lot that it makes me want to beat my head on the wall behind me is social media, right? So we like to empower the things that law enforcement does and really show and highlight what they do. But if you're seeing press releases that show a ton of victims being arrested or potential victims being arrested, don't click share. call them out on it, because things aren't going to change as long as we're giving them a big hoorah. And until they're really held to the fire, they're not going to do it. And when they get 500 other shares, they're going to continue to do what they do.
Really important point. Detective Chu, anything you want to, any last words?
No, I just want to appreciate everyone. I appreciate the invite. I appreciate the ability to be able to speak with all of you and just kind of share some of the experiences that I've had through my career, and also to draw from the well from your experiences from the different vantage points. Joe from the center of the country, Jane and Chris, and you also in regards to the legal aspect. I greatly appreciate the opportunity to speak with everyone on the panel.
Yeah, thanks, Jamie. Thanks, Free to Thrive. It's a really important topic, and I'm glad that we were able to sort of talk about it over the course of sort of 3 of these, instead of a add-on to a larger conversation about trafficking in general. Just the intentionality of having this conversation has been really nice, and I appreciate being a participant and everybody that's been here listening, and because it means that you're all trying to do better when it comes to these victims, and I appreciate that.
Well, I thank you all. I did just one note. I added another webinar to the chat, which is called The Wrongful Prosecution of Sex Trafficking Victims, the issue of victim offender intersectionality. That's a World Without Exploitation. They're now a next series. If you haven't seen it, it's fantastic. They had another webinar today. It was amazing. So highly recommend checking out their trainings. And just this series has been, it was probably over 6 months of planning with Amy Shea and Yvonne Chen. Thank you so much to those incredible women for working with me and Free to Thrive on this training, and for their expertise, and to their organizations for supporting this work. And to our panelists, I am just in awe of all of you and the work you do. I wish we could clone each of you and have you in every law enforcement agency in the country, because we need many more like you doing this work with your perspectives and experience. So thank you for sharing what you know, and helping to expand this work everywhere in a really trauma-informed, survivor-centered, and offender-centered manner. So just grateful to all of you. Thank you all for attending. We had an incredible turnout at all 3 trainings, and just very grateful for everybody for having an interest in this really important topic and being a part of this conversation. So have a wonderful rest of your day, and thank you. Take care.